everyone got a chance to get settled in? Just
Yes.
kidding. I just got here.
Shelter
So.
and
Actually, who is everyone here? What, I see you got a good shirt on.
Yeah.
You're a developer in town?
Yes, I'm moving towards that. I used to be a system administrator, and I used to teach at computer tutors.
Oh, okay.
Pretty much the full gamut of everything that they taught. So, but I actually have a second interview tomorrow.
Oh,
Yes,
nice.
for a developer job. I'm very excited.
Is it for a consulting firm here?
No, it's a direct placement. So it's not a contract, but it's direct placement. So I'm kind of excited.
Yeah.
All right.
Good.
Good luck. What about you guys?
I'm a local realtor, and I've had 1,000 different jobs. I've done everything from climbing a telephone poles to working television, and now real estate, and have been a staffer with the legislature, so just stuff. Work with law firms, all kind of things. And I'm just sort of interested from time to time. I dabble in the idea of trying to keep up with life as it develops more and more technologically, and just sort of more here as a curious, want to be informed kind of person.
Oh, okay. What about you?
So I'm moving here from Oregon. I'm a geomatics programmer, which basically means I program specifically in the field of, for developing new tools for geomatics. So,
Okay.
kind of getting the lay of the land.
Cool. Well, Domi's a good place to land, I guess, when you come to Tallahassee. Cool. I guess we can get started. I'm Philip Hawley, and this is my first time coming here to present, obviously. And I'm just going to speak a little bit about advances in modern web dev, web development. And then just a little bit about me. First, I studied computer science in college at Georgia Tech. And I was back in, turn of the century. And yeah, one reason I got into computer science is because, number one, I like technology. And even in high school, I played video games. I had a Visual Basic class in high school. It was super easy. And I loved computers, even though they were, obviously they're not what they are today. But I also love problem solving. And especially someone interested in coding and things. For me, the number one reason why people like coding or should get into coding is because they like problem solving. That's pretty much all we do all day. Sometimes small problems, big problems, breaking down bigger problems into smaller problems, and that's what makes it fun. That's what makes it challenging. And I really like the instant feedback. So like you could have these things if you're like an engineer or a scientist, but then you got to do experiments, or you got to wait till the bridge is built, to see how it looks. But when you're a developer, you can just, write some code and then run it and then immediately see it. So I enjoy it. I enjoy going to work every day. So it's nice. Yeah. So I started specifically being a web developer since 2002. I had an internship in New York, and then pretty much developed full-time since 2008. And I'm married with 4 children, and that's the main reason why I'm here tonight. My wife is Julia Holly, and she's involved with Domi. She asked me to come and speak. So. And then we moved to Tallahassee back in July 2011 from Southern California. And I'm not going to give my whole life history, but that's where I met my wife, actually, in Southern California. I don't know if anyone's heard of Mission Viejo, San Juan Capistrano, Irvine. So that's where we lived. And we were there, and we just knew we weren't going to raise a family there and live there forever. And we were praying, and other members from our church were praying for different cities in the country. And Tallahassee came up, and I grew up in Atlanta, and that's why I went to Tech also. And when we were considering Tallahassee, we felt good about it. I visited here, applied for some jobs, and got some offers. And then we came. And right after we got here, everything started getting built. The Costco was there already, but then we got Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, all these other things came and followed us, so that was nice.
Civilization.
So we have you.
It's just the timing. My point is, Tallahassee is up and coming for years moving here, and we're still getting more stuff here. And then last, I like tacos. My favorite taco place here is Chile and Chili's. It's on West Tennessee, west of Capitol Circle. So if you're on Capitol Circle Northwest, you go west on Tennessee, and then it's right there at the gas station. Especially like street tacos, and they have, to me, the best street tacos in Tallahassee. All right, so let's get into. Oh, there's my family. Yeah, that's Julia, 3 kids. My oldest in high school now, and then my youngest is in kindergarten. So this is the outline for today. Yeah, when I had to think about what to present on, I'm really into like how web development has advanced in the last 10, 15 years, especially related to content management systems and front-end frameworks. So I want to talk about that. I divide it up into what I call phases, 2001, 2006, and then 2006, 2016, and then 2010 to 15, and then present day and what to expect for tomorrow. So first, when I say modern web dev, what am I even talking about? I basically mean developing for a web browser. This is Internet Explorer 6. Post 2001, which is when Internet Explorer 6 first came out with Windows XP, which is I used to work on XP, but someone younger than me. But and then web dev, it's also short for web. When someone asks me, what do you do, and I say I'm a web developer, that could be both a web application developer or a website developer. And usually people say, oh, so you make websites? And I just say, yeah, sure. But being a web developer is much more than just making websites. It's the same thing as making any desktop application, but instead of your view being a form in a window, your user interface is the web browser, which is becoming more and more like an operating system, really. So modern web dev there's three parts to it, right? There's HTML for your structure. So when you're writing code, you write HTML. It's like XML, it's a markup language where you define the structure of your stuff on your page. CSS for styling. So with CSS rules, you can define the colors, heights, line heights, widths, padding, anything you want, even animations these days. And then JavaScript for behavior. So that's just a simple example there. Get element by ID. If you have a HTML button on your page, you can programmatically make it click without the user having to click it. So back in 2001, 2006, it's what I call server side. This is when, if you visited any site, full web pages were served dynamically from a web server. I mean, they still are today, but if you visited a site, you went to google.com, I don't know if they were out back then, but a web request is made to a web server, and then that web server returns the HTML to that page. And then the browser reads and understands and parses the HTML. And then any image tags are loaded in the browser, any links, or just regular links. But once that round trip was made, you just interacted with the page after that. There wasn't much user interaction on the pages. Pages back then were really just static, that is, they just show content, and then they were form-based. So the second thing is, anytime you had to do an action on the page, let's say create a new to-do list item, right? Or transfer money from your bank. What would happen is the whole page would reload. And again, this is before your time, but you would see, it actually would turn white, and then the page would come back again, right? You remember those days, right? And what happens is every request was made a request. Every time you did something on the page, a request was made to the server returned the HTML, and then the full page was rewritten and reparsed by the browser, which back then, 2001, 2006, browsers were, it was mainly IE, and they weren't as powerful as they were today. So styling was mainly done with images. You had some transparent GIFs and other things. That's because CSS, which is what we use today, and which was back then, but it just wasn't very standard. It wasn't very reliable, and Internet Explorer 6, which was the main browser, didn't support a lot of CSS features. So people used images a lot, which when you use images for styling, obviously there's a lot of drawbacks because the browser has to download the image, and that takes time. Then also, if you want to change anything, you gotta, open up your photo editor and fix the image. So
And that's
old school.
pre-broadband.
Yeah, and it's
So
yeah,
So you were buying the fastest modem you could get.
yeah.
Yeah.
And even then,
That
it
was
was
when
like
they were doing the
guaranteed.
screech,
And it was still dog slow.
Yeah,
Just
everything was
doing the
slow.
screeching sound. I know she didn't know any of that. She knew any of that.
The bod.
I was thinking it was gonna blow up or do something really weird or something.
I know. And then, so there wasn't much JavaScript, which is we'll get into more today. I mean, that's the language we use today to really enhance the user experience. But this is also when frameworks came around. I'm a .NET developer, that's Microsoft's framework, Java, Ruby on Rails. So web developers, they didn't have to create everything from scratch. They use these things called frameworks, which were basically provided building blocks and a foundation for them to build their applications on.
So you didn't have to do the coding from beginning to end.
Right.
You have some pre-built components to build with.
That's right.
Ah.
So, for example, when the request is made to your web server, all you have is just the URL string. And then with the framework, you can have you can define your routes. So you say, okay, if it's /product/ a variable product ID, I can immediately, I don't have to code like parsing that URL and figuring out what the ID is. I can just say, I can just define a function and then a parameter is the ID. And then based on that, I can do what I want. So it's low level things like that. And then routing with your views, this gets into pretty detail, but yeah, it provides a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And then CMSs, which I'm a big fan of, that's also when they were born. So I don't know if you guys have heard some of these, Drupal, .NET New, of course everyone's heard of WordPress, but WordPress powers the majority of the internet today, top 100 websites. So this is when they were born, and what's really unique or what's really beneficial about that is that if you needed to change something on your site, you didn't have to tell a web developer to go change the code, right? But with the content management system, a manager, a support person, whoever had access to the CMS, they can log in and basically make changes to the live web page by editing the content in the CMS.
That's called
It's
the
called
back door, going in through the back door to maintain
Kinda.
the website.
Yeah.
Okay, 'cause
Yeah,
I
sometimes it's
did
called
a
back
little bit.
office, sometimes it's called back door. Actually, I never heard about it. It's usually called like the back office or the,
Back office, yeah, I couldn't remember the term.
or the admin part of the
Uh-huh.
site.
Yeah, I did a little bit of that.
And it was usually just for changing the content, not necessarily the
Yeah, that's
structure
what I
of
was
it,
doing.
but just the content. Like we've changed the interest rates for today, and it's this.
Right.
And so the person that's actually in charge of figuring out what that's supposed to be can go and change that and not bother the web developer.
All right.
And if they could use email, they could work with the content management system. That's how simple it was designed.
Yeah, that's
That's right.
That
that's
was
what
the
I was doing,
mentality.
and it was around 2006.
They can upload all their images. So let's say you have the slider on the homepage, and it changes every day. Maybe there's 3 images. They can go in on Friday and change it to a different thing, all that kind of thing. So I can talk about CMS all day, but I really like CMS. Okay, so that was phase 1. So phase 2, I call it phase 2, 2006, 2016. And this is where web development really got fun. And a lot was happening in the web development world. Okay, so that's the Ajax bottom. I'll get to that in a second. So here, there was pretty much every company obviously had to have a website, and everyone was getting into web development. The dot-com boom was kind of over, that was back in 1999, and now it's 2006, 2016, everyone knows The internet is here to stay. If you have a brick and mortar store, you have to have a web presence, right? And the way to differentiate yourself is to have, your website has to look good and has to function good. So around this time is there was more focus on the user experience. And that's mainly because of the language that the browsers understand is JavaScript. And JavaScript was blowing up because browsers, I'll get to the next point. Now it wasn't just Internet Explorer on the scene, but there was Mozilla Firefox, Google Chrome, Opera, and especially Firefox and Chrome, they went by the HTML and CSS and JavaScript standards. So there's a standard body out there for, let's say, JavaScript, which is it's also called ECMA script. Every year they add some features to it and things, but it's up to the browser, your Chrome or Firefox or whatever, to implement those things and to understand those things, or to actually have a runtime for that version of JavaScript. So once browsers had the latest runtime for JavaScript, then that's when you had all sorts of JavaScript libraries, which again are tools that developers can use. They don't have to write everything from scratch. So the most popular, I'd say even still today, the most popular JavaScript library in the world is jQuery. And back then, jQuery was such a big deal because you could write code once and it would work in Internet Explorer 6 and 7 and 8. It would work in Chrome and it would work in Firefox. It took care of all the nuances between the different browsers. So that was big. Then you also had some other lightweight JavaScript libraries.
May I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
So what kind of professional or probably maybe amateur developed the jQuery?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so around this time too, the open source movement became really popular. So jQuery was John Lezig. It was just some guy at a company, and he started this project, and then basically there's different places online you can tell people about projects you're working on. And then people liked it, and people joined as core contributors. And then it just caught on. And then, so at that time, if you wanted to get a job, you really had to know jQuery. Yeah, because before this, it was okay just to know what I call, or what is called server-side development. You know, your PHP, .NET, Java. But around this time, you really had to know JavaScript, especially jQuery, in order to be a web developer. And then also CMSs really took off, so it wasn't just the PHP ones like Drupal, but .NET had some, Python, every language. And yeah, every language had one. The CMS adoption went up, and I could get into all the CMS functionality, but CMSs are amazing because it takes care of your authentication, takes care of your of course, the content of your site or your app. It takes care of version history. There's so many other things. But this is around when, if you had a site, most likely it was built by CMS, or even a web app, which I'll get to in a second. And then lastly, the biggest thing is this term called Ajax, which stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. So at this time, instead of someone going to a web page and then the whole page loading all at once, what would happen is the page would load, and then whenever the user does some interaction on the page, instead of the whole page reloading again, just certain pieces would get reloaded. So if you're, again, let's say you're in a to-do list app, and then you add a to-do, instead of a request going to the server and then the whole page coming back and having to re-render and start from scratch, you could send a request to the server from the browser, and then it would just send back, it would, let's say, save that to-do, and then send back an OK. And then, so the amount of bytes sent back is nothing, and then your page is also there, nothing happened. You're just looking at it, and all of a sudden you see the extra to-do. Because that's all, everything is happening, we call on the front end, on the browser. So
yeah,
that
I
was
was
a
waiting
big
to
deal.
see if it had saved or something. I would always say, like, do a save, and then, I don't know, halfway didn't know what I was doing, but I was like, let me see if it really is there or something.
Yeah, yes. So it's really up to the user experience is really up to the developer. You still have to show a good confirmation that it was saved and all that. Because if you don't, otherwise something did happen, but the user doesn't know about it. But,
A better example of this would
Yeah.
be if you were doing a web page for, where the company's buying lunch and what do you want, and you can choose a soup or a sandwich. And in the old days, pre-Ajax, what would happen is you would have to go select all of those things, and it would take up space because you would see all the sandwich options, you would see all the soup options,
that's
you
right.
would have to submit the form, and then it would go record your thing, and then come back and go, okay, now, did you want what kind of sandwich? If they broke it up into, because they didn't want to do one big long web page, then it'd have to go send another page. With Ajax, as soon as you clicked on I want a sandwich and not soup, then the parts that would load in would be just the sandwich portions. So that you can go, oh, no, what kind of sandwich do you want? Well, I want roast beef, I want ham, I want whatever. And so that was the beauty of it, because it didn't have to reload the rest of the page, the navigation bar, the logo, all of that stuff that basically was unchanged. That was the advantage of Ajax. It was very cool.
Yeah, the user experience is just like a desktop application. So you open up, I don't know, a calculator app is not a good example, but your Outlook, let's say, or your mail app on your desktop, right? You do something, you delete a message, it's just gone. There's nothing, no reload or anything. And that's basically, at this point, web development user experience could really match their desktop user experience. And then another big reason why was because of Douglas Crawford, which some people call the father of JavaScript. He invented this thing called Json, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So that was the way that messages were sent from the browser to the server. So if you needed to, let's use this good illustration. If you needed to pick your sandwich on this restaurant website, then you picked chicken salad. A message has to be sent to the server saying the user picked chicken salad. And back then, or before JSON, in order to send a message, you might have to use a markup language like XML, which is hard to create on the fly, and actually adds a lot of bytes to the message because you have all these tags. But with JSON, JavaScript Object Notation, it's just a very terse way of sending messages back and forth. Okay, what time is it? And sorry, I'm going really slow here. I'll speed up. So phase 3 is what I call decouple. And this was a big paradigm shift for developers. So decouple means basically you break any interdependencies. So before this, you could describe web applications as monoliths. So you have your one web application, it's backed by a database to store data. Your web server receives a request from the browser, it serves up HTML, but before it serves up the HTML, it gets data, it dynamically generates the HTML, right? But once things are, at this point in 2010, 2015, things got decoupled so that different responsibilities were all split up. So now, if your server, all it did was receive a request and it retrieved the objects that you needed. And then it can return the object. And then something else on the front end, I'll get to that next point. All the markup would be generated on the fly on the front end in your browser by JavaScript. And this was really made possible because these single-page application frameworks, which the term is SPAs, they started coming out around this time. AngularJS, React, and Vue. You guys probably heard of those things. But what this enabled developers to do is separate their server-side development that basically dealt with data and logic, business rules, domain logic. Separate that from we call it front end or client side because we call the browser the client side. So anything related to the actual user experience was written in JavaScript using, most likely you'd use one of these frameworks. At this point, if you wanted to get a job somewhere, it wasn't good enough just jQuery. You really needed to start running on those frameworks. But they were also very young at that time.
Did this save developers a lot of time in developing their projects and getting their?
Yes and no. So it adds to complexity, but it does save time in the long run. But what happened back then is, like I started when AngularJS first came out, and I must have started before it was like officially released. There was a lot of bugs. so we had this code in production, and whenever you use a framework, you just expect it to work. You don't even think about, is this thing not going to work? But for example, the AngularJS router that handled when you navigate between the pages, navigation all happened in your browser now instead of having to make a request every time back to the server. The AngularJS router was broken. I mean, not the official one, the unofficial one that everybody used, the de facto standard one. And you just had to work around it. And there was also a big learning curve for these frameworks, and they were changing a lot because they just came out. But I'll get to it today. But today, these things have settled down a lot. It does save a lot of time. Because what happens is the apps become really more complex. So whenever you're coding for the user experience, that it really has to be in JavaScript. And the more JavaScript you have, it's better to use a framework so that your code is organized and easier to maintain. Because without it, you just might have spaghetti code or code everywhere that is just hard to maintain. And then one other big thing here is JavaScript, which is the language that browsers understand. That's why it's so important. You can now use it for your server code. So not just .NET and PHP. This Node.js came out, so a lot of people jumped on that bandwagon. And again, just showing how much influence JavaScript had. So when JavaScript became so popular, people built, you could say, wrappers around JavaScript, or they made new languages that would compile down to JavaScript. So that the developer's user experience, the developer's experience of writing in JavaScript could be better and more fine-tuned. Because JavaScript had some rough spots, and it was, you would have to, maybe for something, make it a simple statement, you'd have to have a lot of parentheses and all this, language-specific features. So people made CoffeeScript and actually other languages that were easier for developers to work with, but would eventually compile down to JavaScript. And then these CMSs I talked about before, they went headless, which means in order to support this kind of architecture where you have a back end separate than the front end, your back end is just, it becomes an API where all it does is serve up data to your front end. And if with these CMSs, instead of a user logging in and editing content, and that CMS also being in charge of rendering the content and rendering the websites, now the CMSs are used just to, you could say, edit entities. So if you had a list of products, or think about if you have a flower shop, right? You got a list of different products you sell, a list of customers. All those things are just entities. A customer has a name, an address, your flowers have the type of flower, the cost, and all that, a picture. You can go into a CMS, log in, and pick your daisy flower, set a price, set whatever you want, how many, the quantity you have in inventory, and then that's just an entity that's saved by the CMS. A developer didn't have to go and change anything. You could go change something. I mean, anyone can go and change something in the CMS. But what's nice is your server-side link was the API. It can query that CMS for the data, and it sends the data to the front end. to the website. So it's a big deal to go from that CMSs now are not just monoliths, but that they're really just a way to store data, for users to edit data, and then to retrieve data. And that's so important around this time too, is because obviously there was phones, different Internet of Things devices. There's a lot of various types of devices needed the same data. So you could have a central source of truth for your data that could be sent to all the devices. So this is second to last one. This is today. I'd say most web developers would say they're a full stack developer. And full stack, all that means is you work on the front end and the back end. Right? And by now, most developers, and it's even touted by these libraries, we don't use jQuery anymore. Like I use Angular.js, but my front-end framework of choice is Vue.js. It's just really elegant, really easy to learn and get into. And I don't use jQuery anymore. Actually, a lot of times when you're evaluating these different front-end libraries and frameworks, or let's say an HTML theme, it'll say does not use jQuery to show that it's more modern. And let's see here, front-end frameworks embrace right. So now the server-side frameworks, like on the .NET developer, ASP.NET is their web framework. Now you can create a new web project and automatically instantiate a React project or a Vue project. It's just assumed that if you're doing web application development, you're going to be working on a single-page application as well. This gets kind of technical, but there's some drawbacks of rendering everything in the browser instead of from the server, and that is the biggest one being search engine optimization. So without getting too much into it, when Google crawls a website, basically all it does is it looks at the source code for that website. It just says what's the source of this page, and then it reads the HTML and then indexes that HTML. When you have a single page application, there's not a whole lot of HTML sent back from the server because all the HTML is rendered in the browser. I guess it really needs to be able to draw it. So there's no way for Google to scrape the site. They say they can scrape and understand JavaScript, but in our experience, it's really hit or miss. You have to do it. You have to implement it a certain way. So some of these frameworks, again, JavaScript now exists both on the front end and the back end, on the server side. Some of these frameworks support, it's called server-side rendering, where the web page or the web app is first rendered. It has the HTML is all there, rendered by the server. But then once that page is rendered, then the front-end framework takes over and makes the Ajax calls. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. I mean, it does also add complexity. And then at this time, TypeScript also became huge, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. JavaScript as a language, this is getting very detailed, is not typed. So you could have a variable and assign it a string, and then the next line you could assign it a number. The next line assign it, an object. But with TypeScript, every variable you make has to have a type. So that makes for a much better maintainability and developer experience. And then the CMSs blow up. I got some examples here for marketing, lead generation, business cards, course creation. And then, is that my last one? Okay. And then this is my final point. This is where I see everything going. The Jamstack was born. So, speaking of best of both worlds, I'll just go everything here. So, the Jamstack, I forgot who coined it, but it was coined in 2016. It basically means, let me go back to the beginning. So in the beginning, HTML web pages were just a file with a .html extension. And if you wanted to edit it, if you wanted to change it, you would just edit that one file. And then we moved to dynamically generated web pages with coding with a server-side language like .NET or PHP. And then we moved to single-page applications. And then what the Jamstack does is you still code everything on the, you could say on the back end. And then with a command, you generate your whole website or your web app. So all the HTML, all the CSS is generated as a static file. And then those static files are what is served to the user. But the amazing thing about this is it's hard to get in, it's hard to talk about without getting into how, you know, website performance and all that. The amazing thing about this is now, instead of when a request coming in, the server having to dynamically generate content and you know, hit a database, hit this other repository, hit something else, and then render content back. Now, request comes in, it's just a static file, it's returned immediately. And those static files kind of are, they can be served up to the user just like images and cascading style sheets, CSS files, which means your browser can cache them. So if you've already hit it once, it's going to be cached by your browser. And they're also served from CDNs, content delivery networks. And what those are is, these are, I don't know how it works, but they're somehow tied to DNS. Based on where you live, they will give you they will serve you the web page. They will serve you the web page from the server closest to where you live. That way you get it even faster. So this is really cool, and I dabble with it, but I don't use it at work yet. This is where I see things are going to everything. That time it takes for your website or web app to load is really important to SEO, but it's also, users now are so used to things loading fast. If something takes 2 seconds, it's ton of reports on this, they're gonna leave, even though 2 seconds sounds like a short time, but as you guys know, when you're browsing, it's a long time. So when you host on a CDN with a static website, I mean, it can load in under 200 milliseconds, and that's really the goal, to load under 200 milliseconds.
And we used to not have to worry about, when broadband became the norm, we didn't worry about page load times anymore because we had fast internet, like we did in the modem days. The modem days, the size of files mattered because it affected load time. And that was great for about 2 weeks, and then everybody got an internet-connected smartphone, where the data rates were poor, and now you're back to the exact same problem that we had in the modem days.
Mm-hmm.
You're still worried about the image file size. You're still worried about how big some of these supporting files are. You're still worried about how long it takes for it to load, because, like you said, people's attention spans is that of a carrot. If it's not instant, they're like, next.
Okay.
So,
Will Jamstack use cookies anymore, or are we kind of moving away from having all the cookies involved with websites as well?
Well, cookies are more for storing local information in your browser,
Right.
and they're still used for authentication, for example. But nowadays people use cookies, but they also use, it's called local storage in your browser, where they can, if you, let's say you're browsing a site and you want to save something about a user profile, like, oh, I like this site in dark mode. Once you turn on dark mode, they want to make sure you come back to that site. It'll still be in dark mode. What it'll do is it'll either save, your only option is to either save a cookie or to save it in local storage, if the user's not logged in, because you can't save that to the server.
Or are you saying local storage is cookies, it's just under a different name?
It's
No, it's not
completely,
the same.
no, it's not.
That's
Yeah.
what I'm saying.
Yeah, cookies really come up when in the conversation of like security, because they're sent with every single request, even if they're not asked for. So, but something in local storage isn't.
and Europe had a big thing a year or two ago, when they passed some laws regarding privacy.
GDPR.
Yeah, GDPR. And so that has forced everybody to kind of rethink how they use cookies.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why you get that. But this site uses cookies, and we're using them this way, and you have to accept it. It takes up like half the page on the website. You're like, God, I just want to read the story. But that's the reason why, because if they're over in Europe, then they're playing by Europe's rules, and they don't want to get hit with fines. So.
Well, also it's affecting marketing in a big way. I listened to it, maybe a year ago or something that was just about how do we market without cookies, because we gotta find a way, because it got so used to being able to pull that data back and that.
Yeah, because different sites can look at the same cookie, and that's why also such a big deal. So, yeah, so along with static generated sites, of course, web, interconnected services are a thing of the future. I don't know if you guys heard of Zapier. With Zapier, you can log in and pick, okay, when I receive a Slack message, I want to save it to Asana on my to-do list app. And you don't even have to do any code. You just can configure everything there. And that's really, in the future, everything's going to be, microservices, and it's all about the connections, exposing data and retrieving data between the services.
So what's the interplay between technology, say, all I know to say it's 5G, and developing? Like, does the technology drive the innovations in developing, or is that just independent? They're independent of each other, sort of.
Nowadays, like this gentleman said, it did matter before, based on your web speed, you have to really think about that whenever you design a site. But nowadays, you don't think about it that much anymore. So 5G, 4G.
As the wireless speeds
enough.
up, it becomes less of a problem. As long as the developers are still thinking about, as long as they're still thinking of that in the design process. Because one of the things that got away from them was, and this was really back in the image days when everything was an image, was we can make beautiful things, and it was huge, just happened. It was great, but it was very complex. It was a lot of code, and it was a lot of images, and it was a lot of file space that was taken up, and so sometimes we have short memories, and they go, oh well, we have this available, and now let's go add more. Nobody wanted 17 more features. They just want the stuff they have now to work correctly.
Is that why Netscape didn't survive? Although it sort of brought in the graphics, but I tell you, I'm old now. But it sort of it went away relatively quickly. I mean, it brought in all the graphic, what do you call it, interface and all that, but
yeah, I used Netscape
just sort of
before. That was the only thing back then.
disappeared really quickly.
If they didn't adopt all the standards, like the JavaScript standards, HTML standards, and then they just wanted to be more proprietary, and then that's why they.
And they went up against Microsoft, who was also very proprietary, and so that's why you had, way back in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, you had sites that at the bottom would say, this site, best viewed in Netscape Navigator, 800 by 600, or they would even do two separate versions, and you would pick which browser you were using. And I actually worked at an internet bank, and one of the web applications that this lady used required an older version of Netscape, and Netscape had updated, and then the application quit working. I had to go home and dig up off of a CD an older version of Netscape so it would work. And it was because of the way because of the way that particular version of Netscape Navigator dealt with JavaScript. Now, that's really a fault of the web developer who didn't go bother to update their application. Yeah, they didn't update their application to keep up with the standards. And those were very ugly years.
Yeah.
Especially for front-end developers.
Such a thing.
It was a huge nightmare. So with Mozilla Firefox coming out, it really kind of forced, when it became other choices, when your grandmother knew what Firefox was,
Right.
and she did what you did, which was, okay, here's a new computer I'm going to open up Internet Explorer, and the only thing I'm going to do with it is go download Firefox, and then everything is Firefox from that point on. when that happened and the rank and file people started doing that, that's when the browser manufacturers really started adhering to the standards and quit trying to sort of force their own proprietary extensions. Because they just lost. I mean, the wave of users just basically said no. But Netscape went away because they couldn't compete with Microsoft.
Yeah.
I mean, you had a browser that was already built into the operating system. You didn't have to do anything. And so a lot of people, especially older people, the internet is that blue E.
That's it.
That's what it is.
And then me and my colleagues, well, I wasn't, because I got in there and messed around with it, but everybody else was scared they were gonna blow the computer up.
Right.
Like, and I mean, they'd touch the keyboard like, if I hit this button, I'm probably gonna mess the whole computer up and it won't work anymore. And it'll be my fault.
But no, that's why Netscape started. That's why Netscape went away. They just couldn't keep up. But they did launch, they did sort of force the point.
Yeah. Them and then Apple came along about the same time with the browser, with their thing and the.
There's a Safari, and it's funny, given the large number of developers that are on Macs, that there are websites that Safari just doesn't do well with. Like it really, now we're kind of back to, this really works better if you use this particular browser over this other one. And it just kind of depends. Most customer-facing websites are a little better about it, but like I used to be a server administrator, and some of the web interfaces for these servers, that code I swear is from the 90s. And I'm like, these people should be shot and hung out to dry. They have not updated this at all.
Yeah.
Like, because the whole mantra in systems administration is update. You're constantly updating. That's new versions of browsers. That's new versions of everything. And here they've got this site that only works with Internet Explorer 6, which you can't even find anymore. You're like, you're killing me. So it's kind of frustrating. Like I said, customer-facing websites, you don't see an issue because they have to sort of keep up.
Yeah.
But I mean, the company that I just left, their product is written in Silverlight,
Okay.
which has officially ended support back in October. And they're working on an HTML5 version coming out third quarter of this year. This year's almost over with. I don't think they're going to hit their date. And their site only works in Internet Explorer because that's the only browser you can load Silverlight extension on.
Nobody uses that.
Oh, you're quick. You catch on. I give them 6 months, and then they're gone.
So, but Silverlight's a great example of how that was Microsoft's version of Flash, you could say.
Yeah.
It's a great example of how even if a big company sells something, promotes something, says it's the next big thing, it can still die. So when these frameworks came out, Angular and all the React, people were hesitant because they thought, am I going to go all in? And then it's just, the next few months die. Angular was by Google. They had a whole team doing it.
And React is by Facebook.
Yeah.
But
So that helps, but
that
it's still
helps.
not a guarantee.
well, the
But
other
now
problem,
it's mature.
the other problem too is, especially in the JavaScript world, is you get something called framework fatigue.
Yes.
Because it seems like every week there's another framework that comes out that's the latest and greatest, and it solves every problem, and it gets you ice cream, and it's going to make your boss give you a $20,000 a year raise, and it's going to do, and you're like, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it, because there's still this learning curve for it. And you're like, well, how many people are actually going to use this? Am I going to spin my wheels and waste my time? That seems to be slowing down a little bit, but it was really prevalent for the last few years. Every time you turn around, here's another JavaScript framework that you got to go learn. You're like, God, kill me now.
They still are coming out too, but now people are pretty much settled on.
They're starting to settle on the bigger players, React, Angular,